are continuing our study of the book of Acts today, and we are in chapter 12. And let's review last week. We saw a little bit about the city of Antioch. Remember, the Jews from the Christians from Cyrene and Cyprus and different places visited Antioch. They shared Christ with the Gentiles in Antioch, and the Gentiles there became believers. They believed on the Lord Jesus Christ in Antioch. And when word of this came back to James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, James sent Barnabas to Antioch to see what was going on, to report back what was happening at the church of Antioch. And when Barnabas arrived in Antioch, he was thrilled to see that the believers there loved the Lord, that they were sharing with one another, and there was a richness and a depth in the fellowship at Antioch, a freedom that they were not experiencing in the church in Jerusalem. And so the church at Antioch, we're going to see, is going to become the hub of the early church. It's the church that sent out Paul. That's Paul and Barnabas' sending church. They were missionaries sent by the church at Antioch, probably financed by the church at Antioch, and report back to the church at Antioch all the results of their missionary journeys. And when the people in Antioch heard that there was going to be a famine was prophesied by one of the prophets there at Antioch, they collected money to send to the church at Jerusalem. So they got this money, and they sent the money down to Jerusalem with Paul and Barnabas. So Paul and Barnabas have arrived in Jerusalem with the money. They're still in Jerusalem, apparently. And now we pick the story up here in chapter 12 with these words. Acts chapter 12, verse 1. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. So this is a very troubling development. So it's going to take a few minutes to understand a little bit about Herod and James. There are 4 Herods that come into the picture in the New Testament account. So I want to try to explain these Herods, and hopefully I can get through this without getting it balled up. It's a little bit complicated. I have my chart here of the Herods and see if I can talk through this. So Herod the Great was the first of the Herods, and Herod the Great, as you remember, was the king of this region when Jesus was born. So Herod the Great was a magnificent leader. He was a genius. He was very ambitious. He was a builder. He built the temple at Jerusalem. He financed the temple at Jerusalem, and he was a very skilled negotiator. Herod the Great was an Edomite. He came from the tribe of Edom, the country of Edom, and the Edomites were enemies of the Jews. Herod realized that he needed to get to gain Jewish favor if he wanted to complete the ambitious building projects that he had in mind. And so he married this woman named Mary the First. Now Mary the First would have been his 5th wife, one of 5 wives. Married her in order to gain favor with the Jews, and it worked. The Jews liked his wife. His wife was a Hasmonean leader, one of the people who came to prominence in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, and was well respected by the community. And so Herod was able to make a deal with the Jewish authorities to tear down the existing temple and start building a new temple. So part of the conditions of the deal was that Herod would bring all the building material together before they tear down the old temple. And so the Jews went along with this. They tore down the old temple complex, and Herod built, good to his word, built a new temple. But this Jewish wife, Miriam the First, was executed in 29 BC because Herod was afraid of her popularity. She was so popular that he was afraid that, that the people may make her king or queen in place of him. So he had her executed. But before she died, she had two sons. The first son, Alexander, and the second son, Aristobulus. So Alexander, we don't care about him, but Aristobulus was Herod's son, and he was a brilliant man. He followed in the footsteps of his father. He was well liked. He was accepted by the Jewish people, and they expected him to become king someday because Herod was starting to get old now. But this threatened Herod, and so Herod had Aristobulus killed in 7 BC. But before Aristobulus was killed, he had a son named Agrippa. So that's who comes into our story today. So Aristobulus was killed. Herod, you remember, had all the children at Bethlehem put to death. When Jesus was born, the wise men came. That was Herod the Great. Killed all the people at Bethlehem. And then Herod the Great suffered a terrible death. Herod the Great was eaten by worms, very similar to what happened to his grandson in the story we're going to read today. Anyway, Herod the Great passed off the scene, and Herod's kingdom then was split between 3 remaining sons. None of them was as strong as their father. But this Agrippa, the son of Archibus, Herod the Great's grandson, was sent to Rome. He was sent to Rome to study and be educated, and he made friends with these future emperors, in particular Caligula and Claudius. So Agrippa is in Rome. His friend Caligula comes to power, and Caligula gives him the kingdom that was in the area of Jerusalem. I can't remember which kingdom it was, Samaria or Jerusalem or one of those kingdoms, and sends him back to the Holy Land, back to Israel. So he arrives in Israel fresh from Rome, doesn't know anybody, doesn't know anything, and he's half Jewish, and realizes that if he's going to get along in this world, he needs to make friends. And so he tries to curry favor with the Jewish establishment. And so here we have Agrippa I on the throne. When Caligula dies, Claudius comes to power. Claudius increased his influence, gave him a bigger kingdom. In fact, his kingdom then became the size of his grandfather, Herod the Great. So now we have King Agrippa I on the throne with his kingdom established, and he's still trying to make friends with the Jews. He's kind of an outsider, and he is power hungry. And so, as king, Herod has the power of life and death over the citizens. The Jewish authorities did not have the authority to put people to death. They did not have the right of capital punishment. But Herod Agrippa, being appointed by Caesar, has the right of capital punishment. So the Jews are happy that they have this king who is on their side and can do their bidding. So the Jews are very happy with this. So this is all the background that leads into the situation of Herod stretching forth his hand to vex certain of the church. And he stretches out his hand and he kills James, the brother of John, with the sword. Now James, there are 3 Jameses in the New Testament. As if 4 Herods wasn't bad enough, we have 3 Jameses to figure out. So this is James, the brother of John. James was the first of Christ's disciples who was martyred. And his brother John lived to die a natural death. So in the providence of God, who knows how these things work out, how God figures these, but James, John's brother, was killed by the sword. Now James and John were part of the inner circle, of Jesus' inner circle. One, often you'll see it referred to Peter, James, and John. So Peter and James and John were brothers. Peter had a brother, Andrew. Once in a while you see Peter and Andrew and James and John, the four of them, but most often it's Peter, James, and John as part of Christ's inner circle. And here James, the brother of John, was killed by the sword. The other James is James, the brother of Jesus. So James is the brother of Jesus, and he's become the leader of the church. He was not a disciple of Christ during Christ's lifetime, but he became a leader of the church after Christ's ascension. And the other James, the names escape me now with all those Herod names floating around in my mind. I can't remember what the other James is, but James, the son, it wasn't the son of Alphaeus. I can't remember the third James now. I should have written that down. But the other James, the James who wrote the book of James, is James, the brother of Jesus. So we have James, the brother of John, James, the brother of Jesus, and the third James. This is James, the brother of Jesus, was killed with a sword. So Herod killed him with a sword. The Jewish authorities thought that killing with a sword was a fit punishment for apostasy. Crucifixion was too brutal. The Jews didn't approve of crucifixion as a rule, and they considered killing with a sword a much better alternative. So Herod killed James. Verse 3, and because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. And we have this footnote that these were the days of unleavened bread. So this is around the time of Passover that Herod takes Peter. Verse 4, and when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. So 4 quaternions of soldiers, that's 4 groups of 4, that's 16 soldiers to guard Peter. Now you remember that Peter has already had one miraculous escape recorded for us earlier in the book of Acts. And so Herod, I'm surely being aware of that when Peter was arrested by the Sanhedrin, went into prison. The angel popped him out of prison. He went back in the temple and started preaching again. So Herod wants to make sure we don't have any more of this going on. So, verse 5, Peter therefore was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church of God for him. Verse 6, and when Herod would have brought him forth, the same night Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and the keeper before the door kept the prison. So it is an amazing thing that here Peter is, the night before his trial, so to speak. I mean, the outcome of this trial was predetermined that Peter was going to get executed. But Peter has the composure and the peace of mind to fall asleep. I don't know if I would have such peace of mind, but Peter was perfectly confident. He wasn't worried about the future. He didn't have any anxiety to keep him from his rest. And so, chained between these soldiers in prison, it didn't bother Peter. Verse 7, and behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison, and he smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, arise up quickly, and the chains fell off of his hands. So I'm sure it was dark as a pocket in that old prison. The angel shows up, and a bright light appears. And this bright light is not enough to wake Peter up. And so the angel smote Peter on the side. I'm not sure what that was. I'm not sure if he did that with his foot. Give him a good, get up. I have a hard time really actually picturing that. I think it's more the idea of when we were young, our father used to cook breakfast for us every day. Both my parents worked. My mom had to go to work early. And so it fell to Dad to get us ready for school and get us on the bus, and then Dad would go to work. But we were expected to get ourselves up and come down to breakfast where Dad would have breakfast ready. But once in a while, an old teenager, we'd be laying around in bed, and it was time for Dad to come up and wake us up. So Dad would come upstairs, get up. And I picture that's probably more what happened with Peter here. So the angel of the Lord smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, "Arise up quickly," and his chains fell off. Now notice what the angel says, verse 8. The angel said to him, "Gird thyself and bind on thy sandals." And so he did. And he said unto him, "Cast thy garment about thee and follow me." So this is just reminiscent of Peter's interaction with Jesus after Jesus is raised from the dead on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias. They're there fishing. Jesus is cooking breakfast on the shore. They see Jesus. Peter recognizes Jesus on the shore, jumps out of the boat, runs to Jesus. They eat breakfast, and then after breakfast, Peter addresses Jesus and says, "Feed my sheep." And Peter responds, and Jesus says, "Feed my sheep" again. And Peter says, "I love you, Lord. You know I love you, Lord." And then Jesus tells Peter, this is a prophecy, if you will, that when you are old, people will lead you by the hand. When you are young, you will dress yourself and go where you want. So here we see Peter still dressing himself. He hasn't hit the point where people are leading him by the hand where he doesn't want to go. But Peter is still dressing himself. He's still a young man. And he is feeding the sheep. He is doing what Jesus desired him to do. Feed my sheep. So verse 9, and when he went out and followed him, and wist it was not that it was true, which was done by the angel, but thought he saw a vision. So Peter followed the angel out of the prison, and he thought he was watching a vision. Verse 10, and when they were past the first and the second ward, they came unto the iron gate that leadeth into the city, which opens to them of its own accord, and they went out and passed through on one street, and forthwith the angel departed from him. Verse 11, and when Peter was come to himself, he said, Now I know of a surety that the Lord has sent his angel, and has delivered me out of the hand of Herod, from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. So Peter thought he was seeing a vision. He thought he was in a trance as he was walking through the halls of the Antonian fortress. And I want to just show a picture of this fortress here. So the Antonian fortress where Peter would have been kept would have been on the northwest corner of the temple complex. So this is a temple complex. This is the temple. And this building over here, it's a little hard to see, is the Antonian fortress. So this Antonian fortress was built by Herod to look into the temple complex, so that if there's any ruckus going on down here in the temple, that the guards could be deployed from this fortress into the temple to settle anything that may be going on there. It was very close by. Now, this is an artist's rendition of what this would look like. It's hard to get the perspective of actually how big this thing is. So I put another picture here to show you can get a better picture of the size of the thing. This is an actual photograph of Jerusalem in modern times, and you can see that this temple complex is a huge area of the city. It may be, I think, around 20 acres. This thing takes a large chunk of the city. And you can notice in this picture how the buildings are all a similar color. There's a building code in Jerusalem that when you build, you have to have a facade, either have a facade or your building has to be constructed with a certain kind of marble that's found in this region that has this golden glow to it. So when the sun rises in the morning, you see the city lights up, and you had this beautiful glow to the city. But I wanted to put this picture just to give you a sense of how big this area actually is in comparison to the modern day city. So the fortress of Antonia was built by Herod, and I didn't touch on this when I was talking about Herod earlier, but the fortress was named after Mark Antony. So there was a civil war in Rome when Julius Caesar was killed, was murdered. There was a civil war in Rome between Octavian and Mark Antony. And Herod the Great was friends with Mark Antony. And so he had to choose sides during the Civil War, and he chose to go with his friend Mark Antony, who this fortress was named after. Well, Mark Antony lost in the Civil War. Octavian was victorious. And so now the people who supported Mark Antony are running for the hills. They're trying to get out of town. They're looking for trouble. And Herod the Great, on the other hand, as soon as the war is over, he gets on a ship and he heads to Rome, and he appears before Octavian, whose name has been changed to Caesar Augustus. He appears before him, and Caesar says, "Why shouldn't I kill you right now?" And Herod the Great gives this answer. He said, "Because you need a friend." He said, "I was Mark Antony's friend to the bitter end, and I will be your friend. I will stick to you tight as I stuck to Mark Antony." And Octavian was pleased with that answer, and so he continued to let Herod the Great rule the region of Palestine and Jerusalem, and he built this fort. So that's the fort where Peter was held in prison. So Peter's now been delivered out of the fort. Verse 11, Peter has come to himself, and he says, "I know of a surety that the Lord has sent this angel, has delivered me out of the hand of Herod from all the expectation of the Jews." Verse 12, "And when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying." So this is an important verse because this gives us background and history on John Mark. So John Mark's mother was named Mary, and she lived in Jerusalem in a large house, a house that was large enough to hold, as it says here, many people. Many were gathered together praying. So again, we see this double name. We've seen this occur quite a number of times where people have two names. They have a Hebrew name and a Roman Greco name. John Mark, so John would have been his Hebrew name, Mark would have been the Greek name. You see Saul and Paul, Dorcas and Tabitha, Simon, Peter. So this is not unusual to have these two names. So we have John Mark, another person with two names, very common thing. And John Mark came from a wealthy family. It wasn't everybody that had a large house, large enough to hold many people there praying. And some have speculated that this is the house where the upper room, Jesus in the upper room happened, where Pentecost would have occurred perhaps. And it's also interesting to note that John Mark is the cousin of Barnabas. So John Mark's mother would have been Barnabas's auntie maybe, or some relation to Barnabas. So Barnabas is related to Mary, whose house they were gathered in. So verse 13, as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken them named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. So this gives a sense of the largeness of the house, that there was an outer gate, that the people inside were far enough away from Peter that they couldn't hear him knocking at the gate, that there was a servant girl there. So all talks more about the size of the house. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. So she goes into this prayer meeting, and look what they say in the prayer meeting. They said unto her, "Thou art mad," but she constantly affirmed that it was so. Then said they, "It is his angel." So they think it's Peter's angel standing at the gate. Verse 16, but Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But he beckoned unto them with the hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. And he said, Go show these things unto James and to the brethren. And he departed and went into another place. So Peter appears at this prayer meeting to encourage his friends, to let his friends know that he was safe. And he does two things. He tells them to go tell James. This is James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church. Let James know that I'm safe. And now Peter is going to make himself scarce. Peter does not want to threaten his friends with all the turmoil that's going to happen when they discover that he's out, not in prison. This is still the middle of the night, so Peter disappears, goes someplace, gets out of the way. Now at verse 18, as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. And when Herod had sought for him and found him not, he examined the keepers and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and there abode. So if you were a Roman soldier and you were tasked with guarding a prisoner, and that prisoner escaped, you, the soldier who was supposed to guard the prisoner, was to take the place of the prisoner for the prisoner's punishment. So these 16 soldiers were killed as a result of Peter escaping custody. And Herod goes down to Caesarea. Now we looked at Caesarea last week. This is Caesarea Maritima, or Caesarea by the sea, a city built by Herod's grandfather, Herod the Great, a very opulent city and a delight to be in. So he was, one of the things that Herod did is he had moved his seat, his throne, to Jerusalem to make favor with the Jews. This pleased the Jews that he would spend his time in Jerusalem and not in Caesarea. But now after this event, he goes back to Caesarea, back to the big Roman city on the coast, to abide there. And another note about Herod is that in Luke's account, Luke names Herod Agrippa, he calls Herod. There's another Herod Agrippa, we didn't talk about him earlier, Herod Agrippa II, who Luke calls King Agrippa. So Luke refers to the first Herod as Herod, the second Herod as King Agrippa II. So Herod, now verse 20, and Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon. But they came with one accord to him, and having made Blastus, the king's chamberlain, their friend, desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country. So Tyre and Sidon, I don't have a picture of this, but Tyre and Sidon are cities in the area of Phoenicia. They're seaport cities, and they depend on food being brought to their city by Herod. They want Herod to help feed the city. And so Herod was on the outs with them, and they made envoy with Herod's assistant named Blastus, his chamberlain. And so Blastus is going to act as a go-between, as a mediator, to help calm Herod down, to make him kind of see that he should show favor to the cities of Tyre and Sidon and help them with their food situation. So they set up a big, it was a meeting where Herod was going to give a speech and talk about this in the amphitheater at Caesarea Philippi. So remember seeing that amphitheater. The amphitheater was on the video we saw the other week. It's a large, beautiful amphitheater, still uses an amphitheater today. So verse 21, and upon a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne, and made an oration unto them. Verse 22, and the people gave a shout, saying, It is the voice of a God, and not of a man. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and was eaten of worms, and gave up the ghost. So, what a gory story. Herod eaten by worms. So what was happening here is that Herod was dressed in this silver robe, and he was standing on the stage, and the sun came up behind the stage, so behind the people's backs, and shone full on him, and it was a spectacular appearance with this silver robe shining in the sunlight. And the people of Tyre and Sidon were fawning over Herod, trying to get into his good graces and saying that this is the voice of a god. Now Herod, being part Jewish, should have recognized that it was not acceptable for him to accept this, to hear this. But instead, Herod gloried in this. He gloried in these words. Instead of giving glory to God, he accepted that unto himself. And the angel of the Lord struck Herod for his impudence in accepting this worship, smote him because he gave not God the glory. And he was eaten of worms. And the commentators, reading the commentators on this, they have a number of different ideas about what these worms were. I think the most, if I'm remembering correctly, ringworm was the most accepted, plausible explanation for these worms. It was popular, it was common to have ringworm in that time. The thing against it is that the ringworms were kind of a subtle. You didn't often know that you had these in your body unless they would ball up in your intestines and create sudden pain. It's the fact that it came upon him suddenly that has people upset. But Luke the physician tells us that he was eaten of worms and he gave up the ghost. So Herod was eaten of worms, but look what happens in verse 24. But the word of God grew and multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and they took with them John, whose surname was Mark. So John Mark was Barnabas' cousin. So Paul and Barnabas had an affection for John Mark, and they brought him back to the city of Antioch. And you're going to see that John Mark is going to join them in their missionary journeys.